real pleasure to introduce Dr. Charles Dukes. He's an aerospace psychiatrist working with NASA's Behavioural Health and Performance Operations Group. He's based in the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. At NASA, Dr. Dukes provides operational behavioural health support to astronauts on the International Space Station. His other duties include astronaut selection and provides psychiatric support to NASA mission controllers, divers and other NASA personnel. He's also a colonel in the US Army. He's had 4 combat deployments and is a flight surgeon with the US Army. I'm really pleased to have Charles here. I actually contacted him, invited him to last year's meeting, but sadly couldn't make it. And it's absolutely fantastic to have him here today and talking about being a psychiatrist in NASA and all that involves. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's truly an honor to be here and talk with you about my very unique position in psychiatry as an aerospace psychiatrist. As Vaughn mentioned, my journey, I didn't start out this way. You know, I started out as a general psychiatrist and never thought I would end up in aerospace psychiatry. And I had the privilege of serving as a psychiatric residency training director at the University of Oklahoma. And then the Army had other plans for me. After 4 combat deployments to sandy, balmy places, I ended up going to the Army Flight Surgeon School and working with the FAA for a number of years. And this sort of paved the way for my transition to working with astronauts at NASA. The other part of my job is with exploration medical capability, the clinical and science team. And this is really a unique position as well for a psychiatrist because this is an area where clinicians get together with systems engineers and talk about how we are going to influence medical capabilities to support long-duration space missions. So we actually have a role in vehicle development and design to support medical capabilities for long-duration missions. So it is truly a unique position to be in. I'm very fortunate. And I think as the commercial space industry begins to develop, you're going to be needed to support these various commercial space programs who are going to be asking questions. How do we psychiatrically qualify someone or prepare someone to fly? So this will become very relevant in the future. So today we're going to talk about how NASA selects astronauts for long-duration missions. And NASA defines long-duration missions as 30 days or longer. And look at some of our behavioral health challenges associated with long-duration spaceflight and training missions. And then understand how NASA works with its international partners, namely the Japanese Space Agency, Roscosmos, European Space Agency, and Canadian Space Agency, to provide behavioral health services and countermeasures to support astronauts and cosmonauts during long-duration missions to the ISS. So our behavioral health division is a component of the Space Medicine Operations Division at JSC. What that means is space medicine is this big umbrella. All of the flight surgeons fall under that, and behavioral health and performance, which is comprised of myself, one other psychiatrist, and a cadre of psychologists and behavioral health support personnel fall under this behavioral health and performance team. And we provide comprehensive behavioral health and performance services to astronauts throughout their active astronaut career. The goal is to optimize behavioral health, well-being, and performance, basically to ensure that the crew is prepared, psychologically prepared for the rigors of long-duration space flight. Also, we provide individualized behavioral health and psychological support services directly to crew members and sometimes their families before and during each mission. For instance, if someone is preparing for a launch, like today, actually yesterday, SpaceX Crew 6 launched. Today, they will dock at the International Space Station. Next week, I will provide a private psychological conference for one of the astronauts on board SpaceX Crew 6. So You know, I think I'm the only psychiatrist in the world who can say my patients are truly off planet. So it's kind of odd to think about that. But our ultimate objective is to provide comprehensive coverage and services for astronauts and their families, to provide a safe and productive and enjoyable spaceflight career. So we follow them throughout their career. Here's what we're involved in. Astronaut candidate selection. And this is really an interesting process because now we are selecting astronauts for the Artemis missions, for the missions to the moon. So, and we have launched Artemis 1. We launched in December and successfully recovered Artemis 1. That was uncrewed. Artemis 2 will be a crewed orbital launch of the moon. It's set to launch next year. Artemis 3 is actually the return to the lunar surface. That's slated for 2025, 2026. Artemis 4 is a gateway mission where they're building this, basically it's an orbital kind of mini space station which will orbit the moon. And so astronauts will dock with the station and then traverse down to the lunar surface. So the Artemis program has already started. And so now we're beginning to select, or we just had a selection last year. We're selecting candidates who we think are appropriate for these long-duration missions. Another thing about the ASCAN training and participation is, you know, we tried to adopt a more kind of comprehensive but kind of develop personal relationships with all of the astronauts. So we have an embedded psychologist with the astronaut candidate. So this is new for us. So this embedded psychologist is going with the ASCANs to their winter survival training, is involved in all elements of their training. And I think most people don't realize that once you are selected to become an astronaut and you are an astronaut candidate, you spend 2 years as an astronaut candidate before you're even eligible to fly on a mission. So it's a very, very long process, and you know, all of the astronauts are closely scrutinized during the entire process. I provide annual behavioral health and performance evaluations for all of the active duty astronauts, including ones who are about to retire. We provide pre-flight behavioral health training and evaluations, and this is both psychiatric interviews, but it's also training with the psychologist in psychological first aid for the astronaut who's serving as the crew medical officer. It's pretty comprehensive. I mentioned the private psychological conferences, the in-flight BHP evaluations. One of our neuropsychologists does in-flight neurocognitive assessments for missions greater than 30 days. The astronauts have to take a test that's called the WINSCAT, which I'll talk about a little bit later. In-flight psychological support services. These are all of the psychological support service personnel who work with the astronauts before they fly, and they individualize. You know, the astronauts are VIPs, so they will develop a web page for them, movies to watch while they're in space. You know, what do they want in their resupply mission, crew care package. All of these psychological support folks are involved in providing those services. And then post-flight behavioral health evaluations are very important because they involve reintegration and working with astronauts to help them reintegrate physically but mentally as well, and to re-engage with their family members. It's not dissimilar to military deployments where you are deployed for an extended period of time and then have to reintegrate. And then elective behavioral health services for astronauts and their families as well. So many threats in space. You know, you think about it, and I've had conversations offline with several individuals. Space is a very inhospitable environment. And you think about it, practically, if any mistake is made in environmental controls, you know, you can die. So, you know, workload is certainly when astronauts go on orbit for the first time and they have to kind of get used to the pace. There's this adaptation period where We're very aware of, making sure that the astronauts always talk about staying behind the red line in their schedule, because they look at this schedule on a viewer that's called an Optimus viewer. And if they're getting close to that red line, that means they're getting close to what mission control considers to be we've got to move on, but we have to be able to advocate for them to slow down and be able to pace themselves, especially when they're going through the adaptation phase. Galactic and cosmic radiation as well is a big problem, especially with increased extravehicular activity, where they will go outside the spacecraft and work on various aspects of the International Space Station. Danger of changes in the environment, CO2, oxygen, decompression, hypoxia. Circadian disruption and fatigue is a big issue for us because, as a psychiatrist going into this environment, when you think about astronauts orbiting above the Earth, the International Space Station orbits at about 17,500 miles per hour. So the astronauts experience sunrise about every 90 minutes. So being able to adjust to life on orbit to entrain. We have various countermeasures installed on the International Space Station, like the solid-state lighting system, which is adjusted to various phases. We have a working kind of phase, we have a pre-sleep phase, and this is from a lot of research that was done on sleep and fatigue at Harvard that looked at the effects of light and specific wavelengths of light on melanopsin in the back of the eye and the retinohypothalamic tract, looking at light on the blue-green spectrum, how that actually shuts down melatonin production. So we have developed a lighting system to optimally help the astronauts entrain on the International Space Station and try and mitigate issues related to fatigue. So these are all potential problems. Fluid shifts, one thing you don't think about when you enter the microgravity environment, you lose the hydrostatic gradient between your lower body and your upper extremity because you're using your hands, and so they have this massive kind of fluid shift. And some astronauts will describe just feeling fuzzy-headed or having some initial neurocognitive problems, but usually this dissipates in about 3 or 4 days, but something to consider. And they kind of equilibrate on the station, but that sense of using the upper body for all of their activity, astronauts are subject to a lot of musculoskeletal injuries as well, especially upper body injuries. So our primary focus is prevention and mitigation of the risk of behavioral health problems. And you'll hear the operational psychologists say all the time that selection is our greatest countermeasure. We want to screen out vulnerable applicants at the front door, select adaptable, resilient candidates with certain capabilities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those competencies in a bit. And then training. Train capabilities and skills to deal with the unusual environment of spaceflight. Astronaut candidates are always involved in the training flow, from training on the jets, training in the neutral buoyancy laboratory, the tank, to training in Russia, overseas with our overseas counterparts. They are always involved in the training flow. And operational support, monitoring behavioral and cognitive health, providing info and advising crew members on orbit, and at times interacting with the flight surgeons and recommending crew rest if we determine that there is a problem with fatigue or workload. So looking at astronaut selection, this is the first astronaut class of 1959. What do you notice about this class? Well, it's a bunch of white guys, all military test pilots, 5'11" or less in height, 180 pounds maximum. From that particular selection, there were 500 applications, 110 qualified, 18 finalists. 7 were selected, the famous Mercury 7, about a 1.4% selection rate. This is the composition of the selection committee at the time. 1 senior management engineer, 1 test pilot engineer, 2 flight surgeons, 2 psychologists from the U.S. Navy, and 2 psychiatrists, both from the U.S. Air Force. I'm going to do a shout out right now. I am the first Army psychiatrist in the history of NASA. So there you go. In the astronaut corps, there have been 23 astronaut classes from 1959 to 2021, 359 astronaut candidates selected in 63 years. 1996 was the largest class because that was the height of the space shuttle era. We were launching and going on these short missions, landing, launching again. 44 current active astronauts, and for this last class, over 12,000 applications. So planning for the astronaut selection for this cycle in 2021 began in 2018. And the operational psychologists, this is really their bailiwick. They are heavily involved in tweaking and changing the selection criteria. We had significant delays and challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's really, it's a juggling act of close coordination between human resources at Johnson Space Center, the astronaut office, space medicine operations. It really is a huge undertaking to select astronauts. And I have to give credit to my colleague, Dr. James Picano, who led the team effort this year, and my colleague, Gary Bevan, who's the psychiatrist that I work with at NASA, who's not so much working in the trenches like I am because he's ascended to become the director of space medicine. So I think that's the first time in NASA history that a psychiatrist has been the division chief of space medicine. So here's what the 2021 selection looks like. So in March of 2021, there were 12,000 applicants. And this is the first paper shuffle that happens at the Office of Personnel Management in Washington. So of the 12,000 applicants, 8948 were found qualified, 450 highly qualified, and then where you see the 120 semifinalists round 1, these individuals are brought to campus at Johnson Space Center for round 1. They go through a series of medical tests when they're on campus, and they also have 6 hours of computer-based psychological testing when they're on campus. Of those 120, 30 finalists are brought back to campus for round 2, and round 2 consists of a psychiatric and psychological interview, also some psychologist observed events. There's a team reaction exercise where they're sent out in groups into a field and given certain tasks to perform. There's an individual exercise, and then there's a leaderless task exercise as well that's observed by psychologist raters. And from those 30 finalists, 10 astronaut candidates are selected from that group. And here's the group that was selected. How does this group compare to the Mercury 7? Quite a bit of difference, I'd say. Really an interesting group. Age range from the late 30s to the mid 40s, 4 female, 6 male, 8 with current or prior military service, and 2 with non-military service. Looking at the comparison between our current astronaut candidates and the Mercury 7, we've come a long way. I mean, it's been interesting how things have changed over the years. Now, you'll see 2 astronaut candidates in the middle. We have 2 United Arab Emirates candidates who are training with us right now. And here's a little bit, this is a bit of an eye chart here, but just kind of gives you an idea of the background. Many of them are, I said, 8 are military or prior military, but you'll see test pilot, many of them have advanced degrees in engineering or in any of the STEM fields, but really a diverse group. I'll talk about our physician here, Dr. Anil Menon. We have one prior Coast Guard candidate, but really a diverse group of individuals, really a talented group. Because I do the annual behavioral health exams, I've had a chance to start doing the astronaut candidate annual exams, and they are exceptional individuals. Here's our team. You see me beardless at the bottom with Gary Bevan, and our group of operational psychologists, behavioral health support personnel who all kind of make are instrumental in the selection process. We always, it's been tradition in the astronaut classes to choose a physician astronaut, and here are two exceptional individuals. Johnny Kim, who was a Navy SEAL and then went to medical school, and just an amazing guy. He also is now, they all train on the NASA jets, the T-38s, but Johnny Kim is asked to go back through Navy flight training in addition, so he's off campus right now doing that. Frank Rubio is a physician who was an Army Black Hawk pilot. He's actually on orbit right now. He went up on a Soyuz. Here's Anil Menon, our physician astronaut. Anil was a NASA flight surgeon who went on to become SpaceX crew surgeon, their first surgeon, and then he was selected as an astronaut candidate. So he's an incredible individual as well. Let's look at the medical and psychiatric screening. Practically every medical exam that you could imagine, for the astronaut candidates. And then I mentioned the psychiatric psychological examination, 3.5 hours, that's round 2, that's the personal interview. And then the 6 hours of psychological testing during round 1. And then, of course, the observed events as well. So psychiatric and psychological interviews, they really are two complementary but different processes. So my job as a psychiatrist during selection is much easier than the psychologist's role. I mean, really, it's doing an advanced review of systems or SCID-like exam, looking at every possible DSM diagnosis, and if they have a DSM diagnosis, then they are not qualified. So that really is it's historically a 2.2% disqualification rate. At the point that they see me for the psychiatric qualification, if they had had a psychiatric issue in the past, we would have known about it. Other things that are a little bit more subtle, like a personality disorder, come out in other various ways, usually through the psychological interviews and through the team reaction exercises and such. So the psychologists, their role is to look at suitability. Mission demands for ISS and deep space, these exploration class missions, and competencies vary from selection to selection, and they're specific for mission parameters. And the psychologists meet with the astronaut selection board and provide a suitability rating. Here are some of the psychological competencies. As habitats get smaller, this is the Orion capsule. This is what is going to take our astronauts, into lunar orbit. It will dock with Elon Musk's Starship, and that will be the vehicle that they use to traverse to the lunar surface. But very small vehicle. So, of course, small group living is an important competency. Tolerance of others' differences, awareness and respect of others' personal needs and boundaries, respect for common living areas. Autonomy and independence also very important. And ability, with delays in communications to solve problems on your own. You may not be able to communicate with the ground, or you may have a loss of communication. Ability to work autonomously, and emotional independence. I mentioned the psychological testing. It is truly a joy during round 1, the 6 hours of psychological testing. Here's the individual exercise. In this exercise, individuals are given multiple tasks performed under time pressure. As you can see, he's got a box right there. he thinks that he's talking to mission control who's saying, okay, put that box back, okay, get that box, grab a certain tool out of another box. It is a kind of a pressure cooker event where they are asked to perform multiple tasks, and then they may be interrupted to say, hey, you need to provide an interview for CNN, so we need to interrupt the process. Oh, there's an emergency alarm going off. So it is, if you thought medical school interviews were stressful, it's a stressful process. And then there's a psychologist rater observing, and then there's a psychologist debrief after the individual exercise. The team stimulation exercise, also suitability and competency driven, team task with a high cognitive load observed by psychologist raters, and debrief after as well. And then the reaction exercise with rotating leadership. This is very interesting to watch how they interact with one another to different leadership styles, because as we know, I mean, some people aren't the alpha in the group, and different leadership styles, observing them in action and the way that they work out these problems is very interesting. Now let's look briefly at the International Space Station, because this is our primary orbiting laboratory, and this is where, you know, it's been in orbit since 1999, and it is, we've learned so much about life on board and long-duration missions in this environment, especially with our international partners. This is Expedition 1 crew. You know, what I think is interesting, we've got 3 astronauts in Expedition 1. Over the years, what's happening? ISS 20 in 2009, that's the first 6-person crew. Expedition 66 in 2021, 7 people. It's getting more crowded up there. And as we enter this age of the private astronaut mission, like with the Axiom missions, it's getting even more crowded on the International Space Station. These long-duration missions are definitely physically and emotionally exhausting. An example of an ESA astronaut who's deconditioned after a 188-day mission. Now look at Mark Vande Hei. Mark Vande Hei set the record just recently for spending 355 days in space. Really an interesting guy. Astronauts are mandated 2 hours of exercise a day on the International Space Station to maintain bone and muscle health. And Mark, probably before coming back to Earth, exercised like 8 hours. So I guess he wanted to prove that he wasn't going to be totally deconditioned when he got back. But interesting individual. Oftentimes astronauts cannot, if they have a 2-story home, they can't climb the stairs for 2 weeks after a space mission, so very much deconditioned. Behavioral health missions are, long-duration space missions are qualitatively as well as quantitatively different from short-duration missions, very similar to military, undersea, or polar deployments, normal people living in an abnormal environment. It's an operational environment. When you first enter that International Space Station, I mean, there's no up or down. Your neurovestibular system is in overdrive as you enter this environment that doesn't look very organized and very neat. The toilet may be on the ceiling, your workspace may be on the wall. One astronaut said, you know, it's almost, and this was a physician astronaut, he said, it's almost like being a child again. I have to learn how to eat. I have to learn how to go to the bathroom. Very interesting when you think about life on board in microgravity. The environment can change in an instant with a loss of pressure to a module. It really is kind of a sensory overload when they go on board the first time. So crew are either sustained or abraded living in that environment. They adapt effectively if their capabilities equal or exceed the demands. If not, they definitely show stress effects, physical, verbal, sleep, social. And they differ in their capabilities. They certainly do. The pilots versus the non-pilots, and the veteran astronauts who have flown multiple missions versus the new astronauts as well. They have to adapt. And adaptation is a function of environment and the person. And the key to adapting to life on orbit and learning how to integrate into the flow is to keep the capabilities above the demands and increase personal capabilities and lower the environmental and our mission demands. And this is where we can kind of help them to slow down and adapt to life on orbit. So sample events that have occurred during long-duration missions of the last 50 years, both in Russia and the US, all of these events have occurred. It's not surprising. On Earth, the death of a family member, depressed mood, but not major depression, certainly crew friction, anger with the ground, crowded, it's an isolate or it's a confined space. They feel isolated from family. The Mir, there was an onboard fire, depressurization on the Mir, overscheduling. And, one of the things with this current war in Ukraine is we thought that there would be potential tension between, the European American astronauts and the cosmonauts. And, it really wasn't discussed. And when we met with our American astronauts for our private psychological conferences, they said, it's business as usual. We're going to accomplish the mission. We're going to get it done. So surprisingly, that did not cause any friction at all. Reported behavioral health issues during spaceflight. There were 3 Soviet missions that were aborted for reasons partly psychological, the Salyut 6 and 7. There was one incident of possible psychosis that was reported. It wasn't reported officially, but it was really unofficially. A Salyut 7 cosmonaut described severe irritability, anxiety, restlessness, and insomnia, admitted after the mission. A NASA astronaut aboard Mir described feelings of isolation, alienation, and confinement. Another reported symptoms of subclinical depression. And delayed notification to a Russian crew member of a family member's death led to acute social withdrawal, depression, and isolation. What has not yet been reported as occurring during spaceflight, haven't been aware of any physical aggression, mania, depression, suicidality, delusions, delirium, panic attacks, use of a psychiatric medication for a serious mental illness. We do use stimulants and Z drugs for fatigue and for stimulation during mission critical events such as launch, landing, docking. There's been no American astronaut reports of intoxication or withdrawal or any other major psychiatric disorders. We have an international working group that we meet with every year with our international colleagues to discuss policies. In 2009, we developed our fatigue management policies, and really integral to taking care of all of our crew members. So why do we need behavioral health support for the ISS? Well, it's a hugely expensive investment. No room for major errors in space, and a mishap would absolutely bring human spaceflight to a halt. Knowledge of human performance optimization supports our BHP program. We've worked really hard to develop our relationship with crew surgeons, with the astronauts as well. And the crew surgeons listen to behavioral health if we are, requesting crew rest and such. And we're preparing for exploration to the moon now below low Earth orbit. So I mentioned trying to develop good relationships with astronauts. I love this quote because this quote was from a Skylab astronaut who wasn't very fond of crew surgeons or behavioral health folks. And he said, "Son, you got to understand the crews won't be happy until the last psychologist has been strangled on the entrails of the last flight surgeon." That's pretty powerful. I mentioned ISS crew medical officer training. One of the astronauts serves as crew medical officer, so our role is to familiarize that individual with basic psychological first aid and any kind of psychiatric issues to look out for when astronauts fly. Now this is interesting. The ISS med kits. Now keep in mind that what's being flown today was probably picked about 20 years ago, or 15 years ago roughly. But antipsychotic medications, aripiprazole, iprazolam, antidepressants, sertraline, venlafaxine, benzos, diazepam, lorazepam, and then the Z drugs, Ambien, Sonata, and Provigil is one of the stimulants, stimulating medications that's used as well for astronauts. Not all use it. These last drugs, the hypnotics and the Provigil, are ground tested before the astronauts fly. So if they want to use it, they're available, they're there for them. So I mentioned the astronaut annual evaluations. It's just kind of a survey of their career status, also questions about sleep, fatigue, mood, peer management relationships. There are a lot of astronauts right now. We want to know what they're doing. You know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with an incident that occurred many years ago with Lisa Nowak, who was the astronaut who had an incident where she traveled across country to meet. She was involved in a love triangle and basically wore a, I want to say, adult diaper, but what do you say, nappy here? She wore this in her car to drive to Florida and confront her rival, the woman that was challenging her in the relationship with this other astronaut. And prior to Lisa Nowak, there were no annual behavioral health evaluations. So that prompted, you know, we're going to keep an eye on all of them, you know, every year. So very interesting. Pre-flight assessments. This is done a year out from a launch, 180 days out, and then 30 days out from a launch. So a year out from the launch, the astronauts are meeting their fellow crew members, you know, and they may have never worked with these individuals very closely, and so they're beginning to bond and form a team and engage in all of this pre-flight training. So we meet with them to kind of assess where they are, knowing that they've been assigned to a flight, their crew training interactions, any management issues or concerns, mission goals, desires, challenges, any family concerns. We had an astronaut who flew recently whose father passed away. We've had astronauts who've had family members with chronic illnesses, so it's really important to address those before they fly. Emergency notification, and as I mentioned, all active astronauts are seen annually. I mentioned the Windows-based spaceflight cognitive assessment test that's done. So basically that's done pre-flight at about 120 days out for an hour. We want to get a baseline of their cognitive status, how they're functioning. 100 days out, 90 days out, 60 days, 30 days, and 7 days out. So the astronauts are really our friends at this point after doing all this cognitive testing. And then we do routine monitoring after they launch on orbit every 30 days. And then post-flight for 30 minutes, return plus 14 plus 30 days, and then if there are any neurocognitive problems noted, as needed. Subtests of the WINSCAT are from in the military, the automated neurological assessment metrics, used extensively by the military to get, usually before a deployment, a military member will take this neurological test to get a baseline cognitive status. So our WINSCAT in 11 to 15 minutes assesses response time, sustained attention concentration, visual working memory, and verbal working memory. I mentioned the private psychological conference. You know, this is every other week, and it's just kind of to get a sense of how the astronaut is doing, how they're sleeping well, any problems with family or issues, crew-ground interaction or problems. And that is actually an area of friction quite commonly when astronauts are first coming on orbit because they're getting a lot of information from the ground, but they're not able to adapt correctly, and they don't feel like they have enough time, and this causes stress on orbit. Any habitability issues, crew morale as well, and how they're doing as they prepare for certain tasks like EVAs. The post-flight assessment is done to look at reintegration at 3 days post-flight, 14 days, 30, and 45, and kind of see how they view the mission in retrospect. It gives us a lot of useful information, and this tends, oftentimes will change as we traverse, through these later periods as well. How they're doing with family reintegration, post-flight mood, anxiety, and cognition, and also get a sense of kind of what their career plans are, because veteran astronaut, and this is kind of an interesting point, a lot of the veteran astronauts who have flown multiple missions will say, I don't want to go to space again. It's interesting because we think that we're ready and we're prepared to send a human being to Mars. We've got a lot of work to do, and I think we're going to learn a lot as we do those lunar missions. And the goal after about Artemis 6 is to establish a permanent base on the moon. And I think that's the place where we're really going to do a lot of research and learn if we can even physiologically, psychologically survive a mission beyond the moon. Here are a few of my colleagues, psychologist colleagues. There's Gary Bevan, my psychiatrist colleague, and Scott Kelly at the Return Plus 60 eval. I mentioned our behavioral health services. I'm going to go through these quickly in the interest of time. These folks provide services for help connect the astronauts to their families. Also provide those personalized services that I mentioned, like the crew webpage to each of the astronauts. Astronauts have private family conferences every week, and our psychological support folks are just invaluable in helping to organize this. The astronauts have a laptop that they use, will connect with their family members. This is the crew webpage where they can have a menu of things that they want, that the psychological support folks help the astronauts kind of upload before they launch. There are private special conferences, 6 allotted per mission per astronaut, and if you want to meet with a school, university, or any kind of special event, they organize these events for them. Crew discretionary events. 2 allotted per mission, the astronauts are allowed to meet with a celebrity of their choice. Who is this? Jean-Luc Picard, right? Patrick Stewart, Steven Spielberg. One interesting thing is we've never been refused. One of the astronauts met with DreamWorks Studio, and, we've never been refused. It's interesting. Crew care packages come up at least a few times, 2 or 3 times per mission, and astronauts will have special goodies that they request on the resupply missions that come up. Celebrate holidays in space as well. It's a great morale builder and helps the crews, international crews, become more cohesive. Music is a favorite pastime and recreation. There's a trumpet up there, guitar, various instruments. Also movies. This is also a favorite pastime of the astronauts. They spend time watching movies together as well. Exercise, I mentioned the 2 hours of exercise that's mandated. Nicole Stott's on the ISS treadmill as well. If that is broken or the resistance bar is broken, they really get in bad moods. So, and it's vitally important for bone and muscle health as well. So our engineers are on top of that if we ever have any problems with the exercise equipment. Meals are very important for crew cohesion as well. One of the astronauts told me he really enjoyed the Russian food. And I said, well, what do you enjoy about the Russian food? And he said, it's heartier. I'm not exactly sure what that means. Our worst case scenarios, death of a child, death of a crew member during a mission, this has never happened before. I mean, we've suffered spaceflight, crew deaths on re-entry, but we've never lost a crew member on the International Space Station on orbit. You think about the psychological consequences of that. We have a psychologist now who is working on a casualty plan and helping to train astronauts and crew surgeons to deal with death on orbit as well. We haven't had a serious mental illness, no significant crew-to-crew interpersonal conflict as well, or significant mutiny, us-them mentality. The future Mars exploration missions, these are going to be, much greater distance. To put things in perspective, the International Space Station orbits Earth at about 240 miles above the surface of Earth. So if you have a problem, you can get home in a few hours, from the International Space Station. You think about the moon, 240,000 miles away. I mean, it's going to take several days, and Mars, a very long period of time. So looking at crew makeup is very important. Number of crew, gender mix, age ranges, technical skills, living space, family support challenges, training of the crew medical officer. There's even been discussion of having the crew medical officer have specialized training in mental health, maybe a master's level provider traveling with the other astronauts. Also looking at autonomous behavioral health diagnostic testing and countermeasures as well, and increased operational psychology support, insidious neurocognitive response to space radiation. That's also a threat that we are really concerned about. And then just the isolation. You imagine going beyond the moon. At least on the moon, the Earth is kind of in view. You go to Mars and the Earth is just a point of light in the sky. That's terrifying to think about. In our analog missions, undersea, you're still on the Earth. On the moon, you're still within the Earth's magnetic field. When you venture out beyond that, can we survive? That's the question. And so that's why I said on the lunar kind of surface, we're really going to learn a lot about the survivability of missions further out. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. So there's one question which is interesting. I've got a load of questions that I can ask, but there's one question on the internet which is, I'm going to have to say, Jacob Bird. He says, a stellar talk. Thank you. Do you envisage hypersleep, long-term sedation and intubation ever becoming a reality for deep space missions to prevent psychiatric complications on extended journeys?
That is a great question. And looking at the inherent problems with isolation that will occur during long-duration mission to Mars, we're looking at all possibilities, and even, hypersleep is really science fiction, but may become science fact at this point, and that may be one of the ways of mitigating that sense of isolation and loneliness. So certainly is on the consideration. Not a lot of active research in that area, but certainly a consideration.
Thanks. Yep.
Thanks so much. Great talk. Thinking about Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff, you didn't tell us much about personality selection or, what are you screening out? Emotional instability, impulsivity? Do the astronauts need to be good at socialization or what? I mean, if you had a few bullet points of the right stuff, what would that be in terms of emotions and personality?
Another great question. So one of the areas that the psychologist raters are looking at is developing a better measure for detecting personality disorders. These individuals, once they come to us for round 2, they have been thoroughly scrutinized. Their records have been thoroughly reviewed. If they're military, their personnel records have been reviewed. So if there was any evidence of kind of any disruptive or maladaptive behaviors, we would be more aware of that. But what's interesting during the astronaut candidate selection process is there are peer reviews as well. They rate each other. And that provides a lot of useful information on how they view each other. And then also there are some senior astronauts that are in the mix too, and also observe and provide feedback to the psychologist raters.
Thank you. While we're waiting for that question, I was just wondering, you talked about qualified and then highly qualified. Well, can you give us an idea of what the difference is between qualified and highly qualified? Is there something else that you're looking for, a bit similar to that other question?
So that would be my psychologist colleagues would love to answer that question. But on their rating scale, you have to score a 3 on their rating scale. It's like a 1 to 5 scale. Anything below a 3 is disqualifying. But a 3 would be qualified, a 4 or 5 would be considered highly qualified. So those would be individuals that they see as way above kind of the norm, as superior leaders, as embodying those competencies that I mentioned. I wish they were here to speak to that more intelligently than I am, but they'd love to talk with you about that. But it's a very interesting process, and they're constantly tweaking it to find better scales to be able to select the right individuals.
You realize that 200 people were trying to assess themselves against your criteria. Thanks very much.
Thanks, absolutely fascinating talk. When someone's up there in space and you have one of your private one-to-one video link chats with them, if it were to become apparent that actually things really were not going well for that person and they really were struggling, and I appreciate what you said that this doesn't really happen, or at least happens very rarely, which I guess is a tribute to the selection and training, but if that were to happen and you had real concerns about that person, what can you actually do at that point?
So, good question. What we would do is immediately let the crew surgeon know, because generally when we're doing our private psychological conference, either before or after, there will be a private medical conference, crew surgeon and the astronauts. So they know, the astronauts on orbit know that if there's a problem that we deem is something that is concerning and raises questions about their ability to perform and be on orbit, they know that we're going to have a discussion with the crew medical officer about it. They also, in becoming better communicators with each other and teamwork, once they go on orbit, they may not tell us anything on the ground, but once they go on orbit, if there is concern about another crew member, they'll tell us. They'll say, I had some friction with this individual. So they are very aware of the stakes are very high once you're there. So did I answer your question? Mm-hmm.
We've got another question here.
Sorry, thank you, taking advantage of holding the microphone. I didn't see MRI brain scan on the list of screening instruments. I just wondered whether you did that for a couple of reasons, maybe to rule out aneurysms and other pathologies that might go pop in the middle of a mission, and also to serve as a baseline for looking at maybe rates of brain atrophy or vascular disease in people who spend extended periods in space.
Typically they do have a kind of a preliminary kind of MRI as well as part of that workup.
There's one other one which I think all of us probably want to know the answer to. Is there a training course module program for doctors who want to work with space medicine?
I'm glad you asked that question. So I mentioned being an aerospace psychiatrist and being kind of a unicorn or in a peculiar kind of like niche psychiatry in a way, but as commercial space begins to develop, there's going to be a need to train psychiatrists to understand both the aerospace physiology and the problems that you can experience in the aerospace environment, but also on the civil aviation side, standards for approving airmen and certifying airmen, giving them a medical certificate as well. So the civil side, also the commercial space side as well. So to answer the question without winding and going down a bunch of different rabbit holes, we are looking at trying to develop a fellowship program to train psychiatrists, 1-year fellowship in aerospace psychiatry. So we're working, I don't know when this will happen, but hopefully in the next few years, because we can all see the need to have more specialists who understand aerospace and aviation standards. So that's coming. Keep in touch.
Hopefully that will involve neurologists as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.